They thought I was done. They thought the moment Dorothy took her last breath, I became a problem to be managed, a liability, a burden, a signature on a form. They had no idea that the woman I loved for 41 years had spent 3 decades building a wall around me so strong that their greed couldn't touch a single brick of it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you how I turned the tables on everyone who tried to bury me before I was dead, let me take you back to the Saturday mornings. Because that's where this story really begins. Every Saturday, for 32 years, Dorothy got up before sunrise, made herself a single cup of coffee, pulled on her good coat, not her house coat, her good coat, and drove away in that green Buick without saying much more than "I'll be back before dinner." Sometimes she'd be home by 2 in the afternoon. Sometimes closer to 6. I never asked too many questions. I told myself it was her time. Her sister Carol lived about 40 miles north, up past Rockford, and Dorothy loved that woman more than anyone I've ever seen love a sibling. I figured she was up there, sitting on Carol's porch, drinking sweet tea and talking about things women talk about when their husbands aren't around. I was a carpenter for 37 years. I built things. I fixed things. I was not a man who sat still well. And on Saturday mornings, I had my own rituals. Coffee with the radio on, a walk down to the hardware store, maybe an hour in the garage with a project I'd been putting off all week. I wasn't counting her miles or watching her clock. I trusted her, completely, entirely, without condition. And here's what I know now, standing on the other side of everything that happened. That trust was not misplaced. It never was. I just didn't understand yet what she was doing with it. Dorothy passed on a Tuesday in early November. Pancreatic cancer. She was 63 years old, and she fought it for 14 months with more grace than I've ever witnessed in another human being. She never complained. She never made it about herself, even when it clearly should have been about nothing else. In her last weeks, she was more concerned about whether I was eating properly than about her own pain levels. And the nurses on her floor told me they'd never had a patient quite like her. I believed them. I held her hand when she left. I drove home alone to a house that felt like it had lost its air pressure. I sat in the kitchen for a long time without turning any lights on. My son Gerald called that night. My daughter-in-law Patrice answered before I could even finish saying hello. "We've been talking," she said. And those 3 words, the speed of them, the flatness, the complete absence of a greeting sent something cold through my chest. "Gerald and I think it makes more sense if you don't stay in that house alone. It's too big. It's too much to maintain." I told her I appreciated the concern, but I wasn't going anywhere. She said they'd talk more at the funeral. Gerald barely spoke to me at the service. He stood with his hands in his pockets and let Patrice do most of the talking, which had been the arrangement in their marriage for as long as I could remember. My daughter-in-law was not an unkind woman in the traditional sense. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam doors, but she had a particular talent for making you feel like every decision you'd ever made was slightly wrong, and she practiced that talent constantly. After the burial, they followed me home without asking if it was all right. Patrice walked through the house like she was appraising it. She touched the mantelpiece in the living room, ran her fingers along the kitchen counter, looked up at the ceiling in the bedroom Dorothy and I had shared for 35 years. Gerald stood near the front door. "There's an opening at Meadowbrook," Patrice said, meaning the assisted living facility on the east side of town. She said it like she was telling me about a restaurant reservation. "It's really lovely there, Robert. Dorothy would have wanted you to be looked after." I was 67 years old. I had all my teeth and most of my hair. I walked 2 miles every morning and built a pergola by myself the previous spring. I told Patrice that I didn't need to be looked after and that I'd appreciate it if she stopped walking through my house like it was already on the market. She smiled the way people smile when they think you're confused. "We just want to help," Gerald said from the doorway. He said it quietly, like an apology or a warning. I still don't know which one he meant. They left eventually. I sat in my chair and I stared at the wall, and I thought about how fast it had all moved. Dorothy gone 4 days, and already there were people in her house rearranging the future. I didn't sleep well that night. Or the night after. On the 5th day, I found the envelope. I'd been sorting through Dorothy's things slowly, the way you sort through a person's life when you're not entirely sure you're ready to. Her jewelry box was cedar, something I'd made for her early in our marriage, before I had the skill to make it right. It had a crooked hinge she never once complained about. I opened it expecting rings and pins, and the little gold cross she'd stopped wearing when her neck got sensitive from the treatments. Underneath the velvet tray, there was a white envelope with my name on it. Just Robert. Her handwriting. I held it for a long time before I opened it. It wasn't a long letter. Dorothy wasn't a woman of excessive words. It said that she loved me, which I knew. It said she was sorry for keeping secrets, which confused me. And it said that in her top dresser drawer, taped to the inside back panel, there was a key, and that key would explain the Saturday mornings. The key was small, silver, with a number stamped on it. 1147. And on a paper tag attached to it, in her careful printing, Heartland Savings and Trust, South Branch. I sat on the edge of the bed with that key in my palm and tried to think of a single time in 41 years that Dorothy had mentioned Heartland Savings and Trust. I couldn't find one. Heartland was a community bank on the south side, the kind of institution that had been in the same building since 1951. The kind where the loan officers knew your parents. Dorothy had grown up in that neighborhood. I hadn't. We did our household banking at the credit union. Had for decades. I drove down the following Monday. The branch manager's name was Sandra. She was a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the calm, certain manner of someone who has handled difficult situations for many years. She recognized the key before I finished explaining why I was there. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, and something in her voice made me think Dorothy had been more than an account number to this woman. She led me to a private room and brought me a cup of coffee without asking, and I understood that my wife had sat in this room before. Box 1147 was the size of a large dictionary. Sandra carried it in and set it on the table and gave me privacy. I don't have the right words for what was in that box. I'll try anyway. There were 32 folders, each one labeled with a year, going back to 1993. The first year we lived in our house on Elmwood. The year Gerald was 12 years old, and Dorothy got a part-time bookkeeping job at a small accounting firm and told me it was because she wanted to keep her mind sharp. In those folders were bank statements, property records, brokerage account printouts, insurance documents, and something I had to read 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. A revocable living trust, established in Dorothy's name with me listed as the sole beneficiary, holding 4 properties in Cook County and a brokerage account I had never known existed. My wife, on her bookkeeper's salary, over 32 years, had built something. She hadn't been visiting her sister on Saturday mornings. She'd been meeting with a property manager named Lewis, who handled the rental properties she'd purchased one by one over the decades, and with Sandra at Heartland, who had helped her structure the accounts. Carol knew. Carol had been covering for her since the beginning. When I called Carol from the parking lot of that bank, she cried for 10 minutes and then said, "She wanted it to be yours, Robert, all of it, so no one could ever touch it but you." I drove home in a kind of silence that had texture to it. I didn't tell Gerald or Patrice right away. Something told me to wait. Something that sounded a lot like Dorothy's voice. The pressure started building the second week of December. Gerald began calling every other day about the house. Patrice emailed me a PDF for Meadowbrook, not the website, the actual intake forms without any note attached, as if the conversation had already been decided and she was just handling the paperwork. Gerald's younger sister, my daughter Renee, who lived in Phoenix and had not come to the funeral because of what she called a scheduling conflict, called me to say she thought it would be fair if we handled the estate equitably, a word she repeated several times in a way that suggested she'd been coached. None of them knew about the trust. Dorothy had been very specific about that. Gerald came over on a Sunday in mid-December. He brought Patrice. He sat at my kitchen table, the table I built, and explained to me, carefully, as if I were a child, that the house was worth a great deal more than when we'd purchased it, and that it would be in everyone's best interest if it was liquidated and the proceeds divided fairly. I asked him who he meant by everyone. He looked at Patrice. She said, "The family, Robert." I noticed she didn't say our family, just the family, as if I were already outside of it. I said I wasn't interested in selling. He said I was being emotional, which was probably true, but emotion wasn't the thing driving me at that point. What was driving me was 32 folders in a cedar box at Heartland Savings and Trust, and a woman who had spent 32 years making sure that no one, under any circumstances, could take what was mine. Patrice leaned forward in her chair and said, "I asked what attorney had to do with my personal property. She said that given my age and recent bereavement, and given that I was not in a position to manage a house of this size alone, they were exploring options." She used the word conservatorship. She said it gently, the way you might say a word you've practiced saying gently. Gerald didn't look at me when she said it. I sat with that word for a moment. Conservatorship, the legal mechanism by which a court appoints someone to manage your affairs when it decides you can no longer manage them yourself. You have to prove incapacity. You have to demonstrate that the person is a danger to themselves or their finances. It is not supposed to be used because a son's wife wants a house. I thought about Dorothy. I thought about 32 years of Saturday mornings. I thought about what it means to love someone so thoroughly that you spend 3 decades building them a shelter they don't even know exists. I thought about the attorney whose name was on the documents in box 1147, a man named Clifford, who Dorothy had retained in 2001 and who knew every detail of what she had built. I called Clifford the next morning. He was thorough. He had been waiting, he told me, in the particular way attorneys wait patiently, preparedly. Dorothy had left instructions. He had a sealed letter she'd given him 8 months before she died, during a period when the cancer treatments weren't working, and she was thinking about contingencies. In it, she outlined what she believed might happen after she was gone. She knew Gerald. She knew Patrice. She'd known them for 22 years, and she'd watched Patrice talk her son into smaller and smaller versions of himself, and she'd done what she could. The trust was structured so that the properties could not be contested by my heirs during my lifetime. They were mine. The brokerage account was mine. The house on Elmwood, which was titled inside the trust, was mine in a way that made the word mine feel legal and absolute, and untouchable in a way it had never felt before. Clifford explained it to me for an hour, and when he was done, I sat in my kitchen with a yellow legal pad and 3 pages of notes, and I thought, "Dorothy, you extraordinary woman. You sat across from me at this table for 40 years and fed me dinner and listened to me talk about lumber grades, and you were doing all of this, and I had no idea." Gerald called that evening to tell me they had a meeting scheduled with their attorney. I told him that was fine, and I gave him Clifford's number. What happened next took about 3 weeks, mostly in letters I didn't have to write and phone calls I didn't have to make. Clifford was efficient. Clifford had been briefed. The conservatorship inquiry collapsed before it became a motion, because conservatorship requires demonstrated incapacity, and I was a 67-year-old man who walked 2 miles every morning and had just successfully coordinated a complex estate planning review, which was not the behavior of someone who needed to be managed. Renee called from Phoenix when she found out. She was upset. She said I was being selfish. I found interesting given that she hadn't come to her mother's funeral but was now very present in the conversation about her mother's estate. I told her I loved her and I hung up. Gerald came over alone on a Thursday in January. Patrice wasn't with him, which was the first time that had happened in longer than I could remember. He sat in the same chair and he looked at the table for a while, and then he looked at me. "I didn't know it had gone that far," he said. "The attorney thing." I told him I believed him, which I wasn't sure I did, but which felt like the right thing to say. He said Patrice had handled most of the conversations, and he hadn't asked enough questions, which was something I recognized as true. I'd watched him not ask enough questions for 22 years. Dorothy used to say she worried about him, not because he was weak, but because he'd found someone who preferred him when he was. We sat together for a while without saying much. He asked me about the properties, not in a grasping way, more in the way you ask about something when you're realizing how little you actually knew. I told him about the Saturday mornings. His face did something complicated when I described what his mother had been doing for 3 decades while he grew up in the room down the hall. She never said anything, he said. I told him that was exactly the point. He left before dinner and I watched his car pull out of the driveway and I thought about how grief works on people differently. How some people it makes soft and some people it makes sharp, and some people it makes into strangers. I didn't know yet which one Gerald was going to turn out to be. I think he didn't know yet either. The first spring after Dorothy was gone, I rented out one of the properties Clifford had told me about, a duplex on the north side, and used part of the income to fix the back fence and buy a decent set of woodworking tools I'd been putting off for years. I drove up to Carol's house and we sat on her porch and she showed me photos from some of the Saturdays. Pictures I'd never seen of Dorothy in a blazer outside an office building, shaking hands with a man who turned out to be a title company attorney. In the photos, she looked calm and purposeful and entirely herself. I stayed for dinner. I drove home in the dark. I've thought a lot about what people miss when they think about marriage. They think about the grand gestures, the anniversaries, the emergencies, the moments of public devotion. What they don't think about is this: the quieter kind of love. The kind that shows up on Saturday mornings before sunrise, that drives 40 miles and sits in a banker's office and signs papers, and does the same thing the next week and the week after, and the week after that, for 32 years, with no acknowledgement, no recognition, nothing but the long-term intention of making sure that when the time came, the person you loved most would not be left standing in an empty house with nothing between him and the people who wanted to take it. Dorothy was small, 5'2". She made exceptional pot roast and had a loud laugh that surprised people who didn't know her. And she could not parallel park to save her life. She was the kind of woman who would argue calmly with a contractor for 45 minutes about load-bearing walls and be completely correct. She was my wife. She was the most quietly formidable person I have ever met. I am 68 years old now. I wake up on Saturday mornings and make myself a cup of coffee, and I sit in the kitchen where I have sat for 35 years and I think about her. I don't feel sorry for myself. I feel, if I'm honest, something closer to wonder that a person can move through the world next to you, sharing your bed and your table and your ordinary days, and be carrying something that large, that patient, that specific to the shape of your future. She knew what was coming. She built the answer before the question existed. She was the fortress. I just didn't know I was living inside it. And when they came for what was mine, when they brought their attorneys and their intake forms and their careful language about conservatorship and family and what was best, she was already there, had been there for 32 years. They thought I was weak. They thought grief had made me manageable. They thought the absence of a partner meant the absence of protection. They were wrong. They were wrong in a way that had been carefully, lovingly, deliberately arranged. And when the documents were signed and the motions dismissed and the house on Elmwood was still mine and the key to box 1147 was on my keychain next to my car keys, I sat in the kitchen in the quiet and I said her name out loud once, just to give the room something to hold. I'm not done. I have years left and properties to manage, and a fence in the backyard that I built with my own hands, and a chair at a kitchen table where I have every intention of sitting for a long time yet. But before you go, if any part of this story sounds like yours, if you have been sitting in a house wondering what happens next, wondering who is going to show up and tell you what you can and can't do with the life you built, please know this: the people who love you are sometimes working on your behalf in ways you don't yet see. Trust is not passivity. It is not weakness. And the documents that protect you are worth more than anything anyone can say at a kitchen table with their hands folded like they've already decided how this ends. They hadn't. Hit that like button if you stayed until the end. Subscribe to Revenge Accounts. There are more stories coming, and every one of them belongs to someone who was underestimated.